skies across the further north and west parts of Northern Ireland and western Scotland in particular, seeing a very fine start to the day. And with a fairly brisk breeze across more southern areas, the clouds should start to break up quite quickly across more southern areas of England, but across more northeastern areas, parts of central England, it will linger through a lot of the morning, even across parts of eastern Scotland, Aberdeenshire in particular, seeing some fairly extensive cloud, possibly some sea fog as well first thing. And across eastern coasts of Scotland, northeastern England, it will probably stay quite cloudy through a lot of the day. A cloudier and cooler day here to come compared to today, but elsewhere that cloud should clear away quite nicely after lunchtime to leave another dry and fine day for many areas. But notice there'll still be a fairly brisk easterly breeze as well, particularly across the parts of the Channel coast. But despite the breeze, it's still going to be feeling pretty warm for September, temperatures climbing as high as 26 degrees. Another fairly dull start to come on Friday, and that's when we see a real switch in our weather, as once that cloud does clear, we could see some fairly heavy and thundery showers developing across a lot of England and Wales. And it's going to stay quite unsettled for more southern areas all the way through the weekend until Sunday. In fact, we could see some surface water issues by Sunday. Bye-bye.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
The latest GB News travel.
And a very good evening. I'm Johnny Ratner. Long delays in South Yorkshire on the M1 northbound this evening. The motorway is down to a single lane on that three-lane stretch between junction 38 and 39 near Wakefield after a lorry overturned. On the M6 in Cheshire, 2 lanes are shut southbound 17 to 60 near Crewe after a lorry caught fire. On the Essex stretch of the M25, the 2 inside lanes are closed clockwise just before junction 30, the Lakeside turn-off, where a car's caught fire. Recovery works underway. Long queues back to the A127. The A13 is down to a single lane heading out of London and East London, the Prince Regent Lane underpass at Newham. Following an accident, long queues back through the Limehouse Link Tunnel back towards Tower Hill. And on the trains, East Midlands Railway services remain suspended between Barton on Humber and Cleethorpes. That was following a 40 train. That's the latest.
You can stay up to date throughout the day by visiting our website, gbnews.com.
The Britain I grew up was the most peaceful, gentle society that has ever existed. That has been destroyed.
Opinion polls show immigration is the #1 concern to the British public. Are you proud to be British?
Yeah, I'm ever so proud.
My name is Stephen Edgington, and in this documentary, I want to find out how Britain became a nation of immigrants. Immigration, the Truth. Available from the 19th of September at gbnews.com.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
This is your luck.
Good evening. Well, more extraordinary exploding devices in Lebanon this afternoon. But what does it all mean for the Middle East, and can we expect Iran to come back with a very strong response? Public sector pensions. Talk about a ticking time bomb. Talk about a black hole. Forget about your 22 billion we keep hearing about from Labour. This is a biggie. And the big story in the Sun today, that pedos walk free whilst those that say nasty things on Facebook go to prison. Is this two-tier justice? All of that in just a moment.
Good evening, I'm Sophia Wensler with your headlines at 7 o'clock. First, to the Middle East, where Israel has declared a new phase of war as its army turns its attention to the northern front with Lebanon. It comes after another wave of explosions have reportedly killed 14 people and wounded hundreds more in Beirut. It's understood that walkie-talkies have been targeted in the latest attacks, rather than pages. It comes as Hezbollah has launched rockets at Israel, marking the first cross-border attack since explosions rocked Lebanon. The terrorist group have accused Israel of what's believed to have been a remote attack targeting handheld communication devices. The Israeli Defence Forces say they did strike a Hezbollah target last night, but they declined to comment on the explosions. 12 people, including 2 children, were killed in the blasts and nearly 3,000 remain in hospital. 19 Iranian Revolutionary Guards were also killed in Syria. That's according to reports on Saudi television. Now, back in the UK, drivers from the ASLEF union have overwhelmingly backed a new pay deal from the Department for Transport, ending a dispute that began in 2022. The deal promises drivers a 15% pay rise over 3 years, with almost 97% of the union's members voting in favour. Since July 2022, train drivers have walked out for 18 days, crippling services across England. But with the new agreement, passengers can look forward to some long-awaited stability on the rails. Now, in other news, buffer zones will come into force around abortion clinics in England and Wales from the 31st of October. It will make it illegal to protest or hand out anti-abortion leaflets within an 150-metre radius or obstruct anyone using or working at an abortion clinic. Those convicted of breaking the new law will face an unlimited fine. A spokesperson for Right to Life UK said the zone will mean vital practical support provided, which helps to provide a genuine choice and offers help to women who may be undergoing coercion will be removed. And finally, inflation remained above the 2% target, unchanged at 2.2% last month, with new data out today. Prices in hospitality, holidays and hotels, possibly boosted by the final leg of Taylor Swift's UK tour, are driving inflation, with inflation in the services sector up to 5.6% in August. Treasury Chief Darren Jones says years of sky-high inflation continues to put a strain on British families, despite the slower rise. He added the government is determined to fix the foundations of the economy to ease the pressure on households. Experts believe the figures point to the Bank of England keeping interest rates at 5% tomorrow. Those are the latest GB News headlines. Now it's back to Nigel.
For the very latest GB News direct to your smartphone, sign up to News Alerts by scanning the QR code or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Well, when this story broke last night, it was truly extraordinary, wasn't it? Pagers being used by Hezbollah, exploding, a dozen dead and nearly 3,000 in hospital. Wow, we all thought. Well, it's happened again today. This time, it's happening with walkie-talkies. Don't yet know the full figures. The initial numbers we were told was 9 people killed and 300 others injured. So, that is completely extraordinary. And yet, Israel have quite a history of this. As long ago as 2000, they managed to kill an activist with a booby-trapped mobile phone. And in 2020, an Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated in Iran by a remote-controlled machine gun. So when it comes to this sort of thing, the Israelis are very, very clever. And I can tell you that in the last hour or so, the Israeli defense minister has said, we have launched a new phase of war, which is them saying, yep, it was us. Leaves me asking all sorts of questions. If they can blow up pagers and walkie-talkies, are any of us at any point vulnerable with new batches of phones? Or even, you could go as far as to say, lithium batteries in motor cars. It would appear that this actually happened with small amounts of explosive that were placed inside the devices, but nobody absolutely as yet knows for certain. What we do know is these batches were manufactured and came from Taiwan. But I wonder what it all means for the Middle East. Iran, how are they going to respond? Will they respond? It's a difficult one. I'm joined by Lloyd Russell-Moyle, former MP for Brighton and Hove, and Kwasi Kwarteng, former Tory MP and Minister. Lloyd, quite extraordinary events, but funny, isn't it? Israel, this very high-tech state, and yet on October the 7th, they were caught with the door open. Seems bizarre.
Yes, but there's been lots of criticisms, haven't there, about the intelligence on October the 7th. I think this, there will be some that worry that it's a new phase of war, as the Secretary of Defence said. I actually, and I'm not the biggest cheerleader for Israel out there, but I must say, targeted killings of belligerents in this kind of manner seems far better than bombing and mass captivity, which is what they have done elsewhere.
That's a fair point.
So if it's a more targeted phase of belligerents killing belligerents and civilians not, I mean, you'll always get some.
There was a 10-year-old girl killed.
You will always get some. But one 10-year-old girl out of 3,000 compared to what we're seeing in Gaza. Actually, I would welcome. I don't want any war, but I would welcome, if we're going to have war, something that's more targeted and
without huge civilian collateral.
Less civilian damage.
I think agree completely with Lloyd on that. I mean, clearly it's much better that people who are belligerents, who are activists, are the ones being targeted, as opposed to indiscriminate families, children that you're seeing in Gaza. I think the real question mark, I mean, there's still going to be lots and lots of question marks about how they did it. I mean, I haven't quite got my head around it.
I suspect we'll never quite know.
It's pretty extraordinary. And also, you mentioned the fact that it was a Taiwan company, but the Taiwan company, I read, are blaming their suppliers in Hungary.
Yeah.
So nobody's really...
Well, I tell you what we'll do, before we get on to what the implications are regionally, I'm going to get Carlos Perez on down the line, Director of Security Intelligence, worked for the government of Puerto Rico, helping to secure networks. Thank you for joining us, Carlos, on the programme. How worried should we be? How worried should we be about any modern devices, given what's happened here?
I would say in terms of explosion, not that much. In terms of the devices being used for eavesdropping and for gathering information, I do believe that that would be a higher risk than them being used in a kinetic type of way.
Yeah, although if a lithium battery does explode, and we've had a spate in and around London of electric bikes. People leave them in the hallway, the lithium battery explodes, the house burns down. I mean, there is still a risk with lithium batteries on their own, isn't there?
Yes, there's always a risk with lithium batteries. That's why when you board an airplane, there's a limit in terms of the weight of the battery and the capacity that you can actually bring.
Back to the technicals of what happened. So, as I understand it, it was a Taiwanese company that got the contract, but obviously these goods have to be shipped. What do you think happened from a technical perspective?
I believe what we are seeing is a supply chain attack. This falls in line with the MO that the Israelis have used before in targeted attacks against Hezbollah and Hamas, where they have actually modified cell phones with explosives before for specific targeted assassinations. We have even seen Hezbollah use this same technique against the Israelis when they modified a cell phone with explosive that then was brought over into their Unit 8200 for examination and then exploded, injuring several of their personnel. What happened was that as this was traversing their SIGINT and HUMINT units, human intelligence and signal intelligence, got information that this shipment was going on. They decided to intercept that shipment at some point during its process of moving over and then modified the equipment. More than likely, they got an early copy so their technical services could actually learn how to work, how they should be modified, how they should be tampered. There more than likely was some testing of this. And this is a process that more than likely took multiple months to pull off. We have even seen the United States do this as the NSA. When the Snowden leaks happened, we saw that the NSA actually intercepted Cisco Dell equipment as it was being shipped and modified it for eavesdropping and also for remote access.
Interesting. So this is something that governments, and in particular importers, are going to have to look out for more and more as the years go by.
Yes, they're going to have to do this, and I think Israel did a measured approach here. When they took these actions, they know that this is a capability that now, in the lingo of intelligence service, is going to be burned. That is something that now we're going to see these organizations are going to be taking a lot more care of. They're going to be dismantling equipment as they get lots of that equipment. They're going to be doing x-rays of that. So this was a capability that they decided to either send a message or do what we call battle space preparation. And it is something that more than likely they won't be able to leverage as highly in the future.
Carlos Perez, thank you very much indeed for coming on and giving us a technical view. That was interesting, Lloyd, wasn't it, what he was saying? There's obviously been a lot more of this going on than perhaps we'd realised.
Sure.
Yes, I mean, clearly, I think we've always known that there's phone bugging, and we've always known that Israel is one of those countries that leads in this ability to access your data on your phone, but there are other countries that are as well. But this explosion stuff is quite interesting, isn't it? That it's happened on both directions.
Yeah.
That it has been...
I didn't know that until... Extraordinary.
No idea.
I had no idea about that.
I suspect what it will do is an end to the bulk purchase of any products. People instead will source it by just going into random shops.
But I think the point that was made, that Carlos made about governments being particularly aware, I hadn't thought of that, because obviously you think the terrorists are going to be very frightened and, they won't be able to turn the switch on without maybe, being slightly paranoid. But actually, it's something that could be used offensively in a state-to-state conflict. And that, I think, is pretty terrifying for governments and people who are, looking after them.
Well, it is, and there's no turning back the tech clock, is there?
That's exactly right. And they're going to have to be much more aware of it. I think, in terms of the wider implications, I think Iran, because as you mentioned earlier, their nuclear scientist was gunned down by a remotely controlled machine gun.
Yeah.
So a lot of this technology, I think we're just seeing the start of it. And I think people are going to have to be much, much more careful, particularly, who are waging wars against Israel.
Is it possible, Kwasi? It was very interesting to listen to Lloyd earlier because, he understatedly said he's not a great fan of Israel. but if they're going to take out combatants...
Yeah.
This hasn't met, has it, as yet, with the level of condemnation?
No, because people can see who the bad guys are.
Yeah.
They can see that Hezbollah is, a violent organisation. And if Israel choose to defend themselves against that specific threat, I think broad-minded, fair-minded people can see that makes sense. Whereas bombing, schools and hospitals full of women and children who aren't anything to do with...
Can I just put the Israeli side of that? Not intentionally.
I agree. Sorry, I should have been more careful with my words. Collateral damage in somewhere like Gaza, which is very densely populated. I mean, I went there as an MP 12 years ago, very densely populated.
Yeah.
That's going to be obviously a lot more controversial than Israel attacking and essentially defending themselves against belligerents.
Now, you've also got, of course, other organisations, Hamas, the Houthis, similarly funded by Iran. What do the Iranians do next, Lloyd Rossomore?
Well, do the Iranians escalate? They have been quite good so far at trying to stop escalation. Israel has done a number of attacks now, even into Iran and and to their proxies. And Iran has not wanted to escalate, partly because I think Iran knows that in a full-out war of escalation, they would probably be on the losing side.
Against America.
Against America, but probably even just against Israel, supported by America. It doesn't need to be a direct Iran-America war. So I think that they have held back. The problem is, as casualties stack up, do the Iranians feel that they need to engage or not? And, of course, we have now a new president in Iran that has pledged a more... within the Iranian context, a more open view of the West, renegotiating some of the. I say within the Iranian context, not within our context.
Okay, but...
And so I think at the moment we don't quite know where Iran sits, and there will be a power struggle in Tehran tonight with the hardliners saying we need to hit back, and there will be the moderates who did win a recent election who are saying, well, hang on, let's be a bit careful, and that is very difficult for us to work out.
The hardliners, my view, is that they will look at this technology. The fact we're talking about this shows how remarkable technology is.
This is extraordinary. Taking the morality out of it, it is an extraordinary
story. It's an extraordinary thing. And the people in Iran, the mullahs in Iran, the people running the government in Iran, they will be all over this. And they'll be trying to figure out, more actively than we are, how this happened.
How to do it back.
Exactly. But I think it's scary. Sure. But actually, I think it's a deterrent. I think Israel know what they were doing. They're saying to the world, look, we've got this technology, we can get you anywhere, essentially. And I think the mullahs will show restraint. That's my view.
Let's hope you are right, both of you. In a moment, we have been hearing endlessly about the £22 billion black hole that Rachel Reeves discovered when Labour won the election. Forget it. That's a tiddler. The public sector pension liabilities going forward dwarf any current economic problems we may have. And I wonder, what on earth are we actually going to do?
Sunday with Michael Portillo from 11, only on GB News.
Club Classique, previously known as Méthode Club Classique, is South Africa's answer to the famous French fizz.
They basically have to be made in South Africa and also by the traditional method. So it's exactly the same method as champagne, but is made in a different place. So they can't call it champagne because it's not made in Champagne, but it's very similar.
And on the other hand, in Prosecco, it all happens in a sort of great vat.
Yes,
doesn't it?
Yes.
Which is why Prosecco tastes different from other sparkling wines.
Prosecco will taste much more fruity because you don't have the thing called lees aging. Insert the wine with brioche, biscuity, toasty flavours and aromas, which makes it much more complex.
Here we've got a thing called Journey's End.
Yes.
And would you like to tell us, I've said that people didn't want to splash out on champers. They might want to go the Cap Classique route.
Yes.
What would they be saving? How much might that cost in a shop?
So this one here will cost you about £17. So it is considerably, I guess, better value for money than champagne.
But I'd also comment that it's probably a good deal cheaper than English sparkling wine, which is interesting.
Yes, that is correct.
Now, this
Dessert.
second one is called Kleiner Salzer.
It is, yes.
And you told me this is a little more expensive than the first one.
It is.
What price were we talking about here?
About 20.
About 20.
Yes.
Not vastly more.
No.
Are we going to taste £3 worth of improvement? Oh, and by the way, it went so beautifully with the cheese, just as you advised. Are South African sparkling wines, Cup Classique, are they pretty well available in English wine shops, British wine shops?
They are, yes. You can find them in all of the supermarkets. Growing and that's on offer at the moment, actually. That's $11.99 from Waitrose, which is exceptional value.
That is insane.
Yes, it is. And you can also, so I brought with me today, so this is a Pinot Noir only, so that's a rosé sparkling.
GB News, the People's Channel. Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope. From pop stars to politicians, I'll interview anybody in a pub who's got a political opinion. Join me every Friday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube or gbnews.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is GB News, the People's Channel.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel. And as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/your say. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Forget your £22 billion black hole. That is nothing. Let's talk about public sector pensions. Now, over the last 10 years, something like £317 billion was effectively paid in, but something like £500 billion was taken out. But the real problem is, if we project ahead, we're actually looking at public sector pensions for the next few decades, measured literally in the trillions, without the money coming in or being saved to pay for it. Potentially, it is an absolutely massive problem. It's something, back in 1997, that the new Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said to Frank Field, could you go away and think about this? And Field came back with his conclusions and Blair sacked him because the only answer was to put pension ages up. Now, that has progressively been happening. But Kwasi, you have been in government, you have been the Chancellor.
Yep, that's right.
I mean, isn't it funny? We don't really have this debate in public ever. How serious is the situation?
I think it's a huge issue. And, you know, I looked at this in government when I was a PPS, when I was Chancellor and all of it. We looked at the history. People don't realise this, but when the pension age was introduced in 1909, it was hugely controversial. There was a big budget. The House of Lords said they'd vote down a money bill. And I looked at it, and the actual age, the pension age then was 70. And that was 115 years ago. And actually, your life expectancy, once you reached that point, was quite low. So they knew what they were doing. They sensed, OK, we've got to have a pension, but obviously we've got to be able to afford it. Over that century, we've reduced the pension age, but of course what's happened is that life expectancy has gone up broadly in that time. And so the liability has got bigger. I think what governments will do, any government of any stripe, they will look at policies to try and increase the pension age, but not immediately. So even, you know, I'm 49, I will get a pension when I'm 67, in whenever many years' time.
Or it may be higher than that.
Or it may be higher than that.
And it probably will be higher than that.
Well, let's see. But the way in which politically you deal with it is by pushing the date back, as it were. You don't say, look, those of you who are 70, you've got to work till 70 or 75. You say to people who are 40, you're going to have to work till you're 70. And so it all comes in at, at a date in the fairly remote future, the 2050s, 2060s.
Yeah, but you say that, but we actually have a very large budget deficit already. It's growing it grows every year. Lloyd, as an MP, I'm sure you had lots of people coming up saying, I'm very upset, women particularly, that my pension age was put up, the so-called WASPy women. But at some point, we've got to be a bit more honest with people, haven't we?
Well, there was a particular problem with the WASPy women that a number of them weren't properly informed.
That's right.
And so, therefore, they made arrangements that relied on one piece of information, not the other piece of information.
Government claimed that it did inform everybody, but maybe not.
The Ombudsperson found that there was maladministration in the DWP. That's not surprising, is it? Maladministration in government.
No, not at all.
But only for some people, not for the whole swathe. But I do think there is a bigger problem here, that we haven't been honest with people about how pensions are paid for. And people at the moment constantly say, I see it on Facebook, constituents come in, they say, I've paid in for my pension, this is what I'm... Well, I'm afraid you haven't.
Because they think national insurance goes directly to these things, but it doesn't.
Most public sector pensions are not, and the state pension is not. It is a payment. It's a form of benefit, effectively.
Yes.
Both of them are forms of benefit that the taxpayer pays out in the now. And what we need to do is transition, like Australia did in the 70s, like other countries who made those decisions long ago, where people have to save for their future, and then they can choose how they want to spend that savings. But to do that requires a generation to pay effectively, or a few generations to pay effectively twice.
Well, we like doing ourselves down. But you look at France. They still can't decide whether it's 62 or 60. And
how can that debate be happening?
It's extraordinary. And so we have done some things.
Yes,
I think you hit on a very important point. I think people have to know, and you have to telegraph it well in advance. It's no good saying in 3 years' time, OK, we're going to lift the pension age to 70, for example. You've got to say to people repeatedly, at this point in the future, in 2040 or 2045 or even 2050, this is what the pension age will be. And once you signal that, I think people can absorb that and get their heads around it.
So how much lead time does that need, Kwasi, to be politically acceptable?
I think our rule of thumb was about at least 10 years, probably more. So there's no good saying in 2030, actually, this is what we're going to do. I think you've got to give people time to plan and get used to it. And actually, what will happen is that it'll move up incrementally. It won't be a case of going from 65
But there's no point in just doing the pension age if we're not also sorting out the underlying problems of how pensions are paid.
Which is contributions.
And that needs to be contribution-based much more.
You see, the problem with that...
And you need to have a pension that's based on your contributions rather than...
Where would the money go? Who would manage the money?
Yeah, exactly. That's the issue.
That is an issue. But right now,
and it's a form of tax.
Right now,
but in the private sector, so in the private sector, you have trustees that manage the money. In some of the state sector, you have that, but in some pension funds of the state sector, you don't have that. And in the national state pension, you don't have that at all. It is just paid for.
Yeah, but if you went to your system, there would be a huge issue in terms of where the money was going, who was managing
that's what worries me.
That's the terrifying.
You have to invest it in mutual funds.
Like tracker funds.
Tracker funds or other forms of mutual funds where you can be assured that people aren't slicing huge amounts off.
But you still have to pay the fund manager fees.
But you still have to
do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's...
And some people would get very rich out of it. But can we just spare a thought, though, just for a moment? We talked about public sector pensions. Private sector pensions.
Sure.
I mean, it's almost like pensions apartheid between the two.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's... The defenders of the public sector would say that's part of the deal, is that, if you're in private enterprise, you can get massive upside, whereas if you want to have a secure job, and the public sector and the pensions is part of the perk. So, but actually, you're right, because actually often it's the case that people in the private sector pay less than people.
Well, this is the big change, isn't it? This is the big change. I mean, under Blair's time, suddenly public sector salaries went up considerably. I mean, the poor old private sector. What about them?
Well, if you're at the top of the game in the private sector, you're paid well in advance. And part of the thing with the private sector is the opportunity. It's the opportunity to potentially be paid, and that's the payoff. That's the payoff you get. But we do have a problem at the moment. There's no problem, I think, in having a more generous pension scheme for if you're going to work for the state. But that pension scheme needs to be funded. It needs to be honest about where the funding is coming from.
How
it
you
needs
would
to be
do
reserved.
that? So the issue I have with your solution is that effectively you would compel people to set aside more of their current income, for their pension. And to me, that's another word for taxation. You're essentially putting up a levy.
Which raises the very interesting point of what is going to happen in the budget. Because my feeling in the budget is that public sector pensions won't get touched.
Perhaps not.
But the private saving provision...
So the difficulty there is that there's a huge amount of money actually in public sector pension pots. So you're not going to... if you want to raise money, which is what they want to do, I mean, that's of course that they
can't raise... But they can't raid the public sector, can they?
Let's see. I mean, it'd be very interesting. Well, so the governments do things like lower the lifetime contribution in terms of how much you can put into the pension pot. There are ways in which you can...
That caused us huge problems with consultants and judges.
It did, because they all left.
Well, the doctors all packed up.
Because it wasn't worth it. But that's the sort of thing they can do.
Yeah, there are some professions in this world that are very mobile, and consultants are one of those ones where you can go to almost any country in the world and get a highly paid
But I think it would be very difficult...
Just by buying an aeroplane ticket, effectively.
Yes. But I think it's very difficult, Nigel, for the government to discriminate, which is what it would be, between private sector pensions... in the public sector. I'm surprised if...
On the 30th of October, we will find out. In a moment, we will talk about the big story in The Sun today, that paedophiles, who in some cases have been consuming vast amounts of seriously underage child pornography, walk free, whilst those that say nasty things on Facebook go to prison. Is this two-tier justice?
Hello, good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update. A lot of cloud to come in overnight tonight across eastern areas. That will make for a fairly dull start to Thursday, with the best of any brighter weather across western areas. So we do have an easterly wind at the moment. That's because high pressure is sat over to the north and east of the UK, bringing in that easterly wind, and that's what's going to drag in the cloud overnight once again tonight. I think the cloud is going to be more extensive tonight compared to previous nights, and will probably linger a little longer into tomorrow morning. We could see some drizzly rain over any high ground as well, but with the strength of the breeze and fairly extensive cloud, it's going to be another mild night away from the clearer skies across the further north and west parts of Northern Ireland and western Scotland in particular, seeing a very fine start to the day. And with a fairly brisk breeze across more southern areas, the clouds should start to break up quite quickly across more southern areas of England, but across more northeastern areas, parts of central England, it will linger through a lot of the morning, even across parts of eastern Scotland, Aberdeenshire in particular, seeing some fairly extensive cloud, possibly some sea fog as well first thing. And across eastern coasts of Scotland, northeastern England, it will probably stay quite cloudy through a lot of the day. A cloudier and cooler day here to come compared to today, but elsewhere that cloud should clear away quite nicely after lunchtime to leave another dry and fine day for many areas. But notice there'll still be a fairly brisk easterly breeze as well, particularly across the parts of the Channel coast. But despite the breeze, it's still going to be feeling pretty warm for September, temperatures climbing as high as 26 degrees. Another fairly dull start to come on Friday, and that's when we see a real switch in our weather, as once that cloud does clear, we could see some fairly heavy and thundery showers developing across a lot of England and Wales. And it's going to stay quite unsettled for more southern areas all the way through the weekend until Sunday. In fact, we could see some surface water issues by Sunday. Bye-bye.
The Britain I grew up in was the most peaceful, gentle society that has ever existed. That has been destroyed.
Opinion polls show immigration is the #1 concern to the British public. Are you proud to be British?
Yeah, I'm ever so proud.
My name is Stephen Edgington, and in this documentary, I want to find out how Britain became a nation of immigrants. Immigration, the Truth. Available from the 19th of September at gbnews.com.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here We do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and he did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, following the Hugh Edwards story, The Sun today did a really massive front-page piece saying that paedophiles who'd hoarded as many as 1 million images, some of them involving children of extremely young ages, are given 0 days in jail. As those that commit relatively minor offences, like stealing a bike, get short custodial sentences. But in particular, those who've said horrid things, and they are horrid things, in the heat of the moment, anger, drink, who knows quite why. And they've been going to prison, getting sentences of a couple of years, maybe up to 3 years. There is a growing perception in this country that we have two-tier policing, that we have a two-tier judicial system. It's a point I did actually raise in Prime Minister's Questions a couple of weeks ago. Whenever I make this point, that there is a strong growing perception of this, it appears the government gets very angry. So, Lloyd Russell-Moyle, a growing number of people think there is a two-tier system in operation. What say you?
Well, it depends what you mean by two-tier. When two-tier was first rolled out, my understanding was that it was kind of about a semi-racial differential between white rioters versus black rioters. I don't think that's necessarily true. I dispute that. Do we have a system of justice at the moment that doesn't work, that means some people the public think should get harsher sentences, irrespective of their race now? So moving the race argument
we've moved on,
compared to other people that get more lenient sentences. We talked about this previously. Then I think you're right that the public does think that there is a problem, and part of the problem is that we have not really been honest with the public for about a lot of sentences. So we give these elongated sentences and people come out halfway through their time, and we give them elongated to make the public feel better, and then we kind of do the dirty behind their back. It would be much better to the public, and I actually do think there is space for a total review of sentencing guidelines to say, what do you want? What crimes do you think are the most serious? Bearing in mind, rioting will always be the serious because it's very serious for the state, but not for individuals in the same sense. But ignoring rioting as a crime.
So would this be...
Things like paedophilia, I think the public think are extremely serious.
They do.
And they should be treated more seriously.
And that's what the Sun's put it on the front page.
And so I think that...
Where would you debate this, Lloyd? Would this be a big parliamentary debate? How would we do it?
Look, I'm not usually a great fan of people's assemblies when the Europhiles talked about it to try and sort out Brexit. I thought it was rubbish. But I actually do think that tricky social issues, like sentencing, social issues, actually a set of people's assemblies, consultations going around the country where people could feed in.
That's hugely bureaucratic.
Yes, but I think this is... I think this is a piece of work
but it is a
probably
proposal.
So bureaucratic.
I get where you're coming from.
So
what I think is happening is that society's tolerance of these crimes has disappeared. 20 years ago, these were serious crimes, but people thought, well, it's the privacy of their own home, they haven't actually harmed people. That's changed. And when the perception changes, I think that judges and the law can be quite slow in catching up to that. And clearly, I think today there is a huge mismatch between what the public think of paedophilia and these non-custodial sentences that are being handed out. There's clearly a mismatch.
So how do we bridge that? How do we bridge that? I mean, what Lloyd was saying was he's proposing people's assemblies. Trouble is, who gets appointed onto them? But Kwasi, if there is... I mean, look, if we don't have confidence in the judicial system, that's a bad place for us to be.
Look, I think it's a government issue. I think it is a parliamentary, quasi-parliamentary government executive issue. And clearly there's a mismatch. And similarly with the social media, because whatever the tolerance of racism and agitation and all of that stuff within the establishment, for want of a better phrase, is zero, they go after People who are, they've had a night in the pub and they've said silly things on Twitter. Now, I don't want to demean or diminish that, but you can see how there is that difference. Now, I don't think it's willful. I don't think they say, look, we're going to have a two-tier system and we're going to bang up the people we don't like and let off the people we like. But I think over time it's evolved in.
And we need to have confidence in the system. I tell you what, I'm going to draw stumps on that one, because how do you know you're getting old? When you find out it's 10 years to the day that we had the Scottish independence, so-called separation was the word that I used, referendum. And Nicola Sturgeon has been speaking in public today saying that Scotland will leave the United Kingdom and that there will be a united Ireland. She didn't predict we'd rejoin the EU, which surprised me, because she generally is against the result of every single referendum and thinks they should be overturned, which is true. Funny, isn't it? Labour, the dominant party in Scotland forever, it seemed. Suddenly the impression that Labour was really quite corrupt in Scotland, the SNP then dominating totally, but losing the separation vote. Is Scottish independence dead now?
I think whilst you have a Labour government in Westminster, it is much harder to see a Scotland becoming independent, because the SNP don't really have something to kick back against. Their whole raison d'etre was kicking back against a right-wing government that didn't reflect the views of Scotland. And no one seriously can... I mean, I think that the Labour Party is more right-wing than I would like it, but no one seriously can say that the Labour Party is a right-wing government. That
people do. I mean, people do. Some of your former friends...
But we can't really
in the Corbynista wing of the party.
But not the majority, is it? So I think on that sense, for the time being, it is dead. But if we end up with a right-wing conservative Reform Party kind of government in the future, I can see how that same rhetoric could be whipped up. I think on the island prediction... Unless
the politics of Scotland change.
Of course.
I think which is possible.
Scotland has not always been a left-wing bastion.
No.
Now, which is a myth that the SNP like to pretend that they were somehow the victims of empire, despite the fact that most of the...
The Scots dominated the empire.
They've completely rebranded
and it was always a progressive thing.
It's all done, isn't it?
So look, I think they're done for this generation. I mean, it was interesting when they said when they had the referendum in 2014, they said this will decide it for a generation. Then they lost, so they wanted a rerun. And then the same people I remember in Parliament were arguing for it, and then they lost.
The same
and we used to
people.
say from the Tory backbenchers 2-0 against the SNP.
And a last thought here is we learned that Sue Gray is paid more than the Prime Minister. But actually, this is not a huge surprise, and hey, it's the civil service that run the country anyway, Lloyd, isn't it?
Well, I think that we should have more political appointments and SPADs, effectively, at the very top levels of government. And I wrote a report with the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee that not an American system, but there are hybrid systems. In Germany, you have, for example, where you do have that balance. And I do think that we have a problem sometimes at the moment where there aren't enough people with political minds in the civil service. So a reform of it would make sense, and you are having to pay people decent salaries because they are permanent and they are the experts.
So my issue with
the experts are...
They should beware. This is and I know it's very controversial and very unpopular view, but I think the Prime Minister of this country is paid too little. You look at every G7 country, the President of the United States, $400,000, the Chancellor of Germany, I think, is about 350,000 euros. All these people who are heads of government. And then people say, well, they have grace and favour homes. But if you go to them, they're not in terribly good nick.
But we underpay all of our elected representatives. I think we underpay MPs. We definitely underpay councillors. All of those people we kind of dismiss as a...
that is... I tell you what, that is...
I think the PM is the case...
That is it. And I can tell at home, you're sitting there, you're shaking your head, saying, this is not wrong. I know they are.
The Prime Minister. I'm not saying about everyone else.
I think the PM, because I mean, when the PM can't afford to buy his own glasses, I mean, it's very serious situation. Funny thing about this is that when we were members of the European Union, there were 10,000 people working for the European Union in Brussels whose take-home pay was higher than the British prime ministers. So if you think our bureaucrats are paid too much, well, Brussels, they're paid a lot more. Now, in a moment, a more controversial subject, I think. Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, speaking in Hong Kong earlier this week, saying we are going to have closer relations with China under a Labour government. Is it right that he said that in a territory like Hong Kong?
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Would you have Harry back with open arms? And this is Ian. Hi, Ian. Harry is unfortunately not well. He's an emotional wreck. Ian, you actually took the words out of my mouth. I remember when I was younger, queuing up for hours for West Ham tickets. I'm that sad. But at least I got the ticket. It was my ticket. They knew it was me, and there were no touts involved. It's Forever says Harry can stay away. He was so quick to condemn this country as racist and to trash the Queen and royal family's reputations. He should be banished and his titles removed. He has not earned the right to call himself anything with a royal title. Ooh, passionate. Since moving to the US with Meghan, the American dream has had a number of issues for him, I think it's fair to say. But if Harry was to return, would he be welcome? And could he make it up with William? Look, if Oasis, sorry I said the O word, have done it, can William and Harry?
Well, I think it's going to present a lot of challenges. I mean, I've got to be clear here. When it comes to reconciliation, if it's possible, obviously, to mend the rift with William, clearly that is to be welcomed. But as for Harry returning, what precisely would that mean? What precisely would Harry want? Because if it is in any sense a return to royal duties, you really got to be very, very careful with what you're dealing with. As far as the royal family are concerned, for goodness sake, reconciliation, yes, but actual work as a senior working royal is not, in my opinion.
So I always think it's quite funny listening to serious people talk seriously about the royals, because it's not that serious, a lot of it. But actually, I think where I'm fascinated by them is that we can sort of see a bit of ourselves as a society and as individuals.
GB News, the People's Channel.
Welcome to State of the Nation, daily plunge into the stories shaping our country. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Monday to Thursday we bring you the insights, the facts, the truth about how our country is being governed. Because what happens in Downing Street matters down your street. Tune in to State of the Nation every Monday to Thursday, 8 to 9 o'clock. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it? Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Lord Mandelson, speaking on Monday, said that this Labour government would be have a much better relationship with China, feeling that the last government was actually relatively aggressive. I have to say, our China policy has been all over the place for years. I've been pretty sceptical about China myself, but somebody who is a Sinophile is, of course, Stanley Johnson, conservationist former MEP, and has just retraced Marco Polo's 4,000-mile journey along the Silk Road, and you're back, fit, and with a book.
Well, I always like to have a book. I would like to produce this as my 26th book. It's one of the larger books. And Nigel, it gives me great pleasure. It's called In the Footsteps of Marco Polo. It's the story of the trip which I have just completed with my fourth son, Max. And we, as you say, we went all along the Silk Road. It started 60 years ago when I was at Oxford. We got as far as the Chinese border and couldn't get in. And then, I've got to say, we had now a wonderful, wonderful experience going from the high Himalayas down into Xinjiang, Gansu, Inner Mongolia, Kublai Khan territory altogether, because we actually were in Kubla Khan itself.
Fantastic.
Chengdu, and we go on. Now, I'm going to sign this to you,
good,
Nigel.
Very good.
Now, there is a theory that if you sign a book, you lower its value.
Of course.
So would you prefer me not?
No, I'd love you to sign it. Now, Stanley, while you're signing this, and I know you are, as I say, a great signer, but Lord Mandelson was there in Hong Kong earlier on this week, saying the government will forge closer relations with China. And, yep, China is big. Many thanks indeed.
I can't.
Many thanks indeed. There you are. Bit of bedtime. I'm sure. No, I'm sure. Yeah. No, it'll be great. I'm sure.
Book of the week in the Daily Mail.
I'm not surprised at all. Now, Stanley, how appropriate is it for Peter Mandelson to say these words in Hong Kong, given that all the promises that were made in that treaty between us and the Chinese government have been breached?
I don't think Mandelson was totally fair in the sense of the headline. I've seen the headline, Lord Mandelson slams Tory boycott of China.
There was no boycott.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think that actually the Conservative government, yes, it wasn't the golden age of drinking in the pub in Chequers with President Xi and so on and so forth. That was perhaps not it. But nonetheless, if you look at the actual considered position of the Conservative government, I'm not talking about necessarily Ian Duncan Smith. I'm not necessarily talking about Tom Tugendhat or whatever. I looked it up. I looked up the fantastic speech which James cleverly, as Foreign Secretary, gave at the end of April.
But Stanley, I'm going to return to my point.
Yeah, okay.
The promises, the solemn promises in a treaty that were made about the autonomy of Hong Kong have they not been completely breached?
Well, I know Chris Patton's
Forget Chris Patton. We signed a treaty with China. They said autonomy until 2047, and that has completely disappeared.
Can we look at other aspects of the relationship?
Stanley, I am saying I feel that for Mandelson to say that in Hong Kong, of all places, was inappropriate.
I don't think you can judge the whole of our relationship with China on the Hong Kong issue. I just don't think you can.
But well, let's broaden it out.
Yeah.
How can we trust them?
Well, I have had a very, very close working relationship with China for the last 3 or 4 years when I've been planning this Marco Polo trip, and I can tell you I have had an exemplary relationship with the Chinese embassy here. And then in China itself, we had fantastic collaboration and cooperation at every level.
Are you a representative, in a sense? Because you sound like it.
Well, it certainly worries me, actually. I see that you've got some foreign registration act out there. I might have to sign a very complete... No, you shouldn't put it this way. What this book was about was building bridges, and I still think the building bridges side is absolutely vital. We cannot. And by the way, he said some very important things cleverly. I mean, he was speaking as Foreign Secretary. He said, actually, of course, we have to take a firm line when we see an authoritarian regime doing things we don't want. And that included Hong Kong, it included, obviously, the Uyghurs, it included other things. But he also made it absolutely clear there's some key issues where we have to work with China. Climate change, energy policy, health data, for example, crucial. Look at all the things which they have.
So climate change. So what are they building? Is it 80 new coal-fired stations every year? No. China are burning more coal today than they've ever burnt.
China's progress in terms of moving on renewables is absolutely extraordinary. We wouldn't be anywhere in the climate change treaty if we hadn't now had this revolution in China.
So the Chinese build a few wind turbines.
It's not more than a few. It's more than a few, I can tell you.
But they fine. But you've got there a population that want to have fridges and want to have all the things we have in the West. The truth is they're burning more coal today than they've ever burnt.
Yep, you look at it, and they are bringing down the year of peak emissions. I think they're bringing it down from 2035 to 2030 or something like that. So it's a huge impact. You can see the wind turbines everywhere you can go. we have seen, if you see the film we've made of this trip, incredible solar panel farms all over the place.
Gosh, that's going to be our future if we're not careful.
I tell you. And the other things I deal with, OK, I dealt with them on the COP26, biodiversity, China, you may say I sound like a mouthpiece for China. No, because I work on these things, and I see, for example, the biodiversity treaty which got delivered in Montreal last December. It was co-chaired by China, and it was a fantastic job. It's called the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity
So
Treaty.
do you think China should become an ally?
China is an ally. I mean, I thought this absolute nonsense of, I've got to say, this is where I do disagree with the Tories, the idea that you can lump China, as we did in our manifesto, with Russia and Iran and put them in a kind of special category as foreign agents, foreign enemies. Big mistake.
All right, quick comment, Lloyd, on that. What should our relationship with China be henceforth?
Well, our relationship should be probably closer than it has been, actually, in the past.
So you agree with Mandelson, basically?
I broadly agree with Mandelson. What we must do is ensure that those individual Hong Kongers who feel like they have a responsibility, we have a responsibility to, are still given the support that we need, and we need to prevent China trying to interfere, which they are doing, in universities and think tanks in Britain. So there are some things that we need to be careful about. But there are lots of states that we cooperate with, that we have big disagreements with. With India, we have huge disagreements around Kashmir and other areas, but we don't suddenly cut off the whole of India.
But nobody was saying
should we trust them?
I think we've got to tread very carefully with them, but at the same time, we've got to engage with them. The idea that you can just somehow forget about China and say goodbye, we're not going to do anything with you, we're not going to...
Because they're just too big.
They're too big. They're too powerful, they're too big, and they're too economically significant. And we've got to have a dialogue with them in the way that Stanley is doing. Now, I remember as a backbencher, we were high-fiving them, and she came to that pub in Chequers.
I know, had a pie.
And he had to pretend that he liked bitter, which he obviously...
Didn't he leave one of his children behind?
A different pub. And we changed. Once the Uyghurs, human rights, Hong Kong, we took a different view. And there was always a balance within the government as to who, how we should engage with them, and that's a healthy discussion. But we can't just simply say, "You're an ally, we love you, you can do whatever you want." But we also can't say, "Go away, we'll pretend that you don't exist."
You see, there's another hugely important treaty coming up, international treaty, and that's the Global Plastics Convention. This is going to come up now, with any luck, in Galapagos. We absolutely need China to be 100% on side with this one.
Well, Stanley, if they're on side and they play by the rules and they tell the truth, I might become a little bit less sceptical. But I want to say thank you for coming on the programme. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you to my regular panel who always give us such intelligent debate. It's reasonably intelligent. Talking of intelligent, coming up next on State of the Nation is Jacob Rees-Mogg, who joins me down the line from the next door studio. Jacob, what is your big debate this evening?
The big debate's on freedom of speech, that this lady, Bernadette Spoffforth, was held by the police for 36 hours for making a mistake. She got something wrong, she admitted it, but this was such a heavy-handed approach. Paedophiles don't seem to go to jail, but you say something the state doesn't like on Twitter, and you get held in a prison cell for 36 hours, searched, and treated in a way that no decent person should expect to be treated. So we're going to be talking about that with Toby Young, and then more on the Frockgate scandal.
Right, well, Jacob taking a very similar view to me, that it does appear to be somewhat like two-tier justice. Therefore, we need to have a proper open debate and think about this. But that's it. I'm done for the evening. Let's have a look what the weather holds in store for us with Annie Shuttleworth.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update. A lot of cloud to come in overnight tonight across eastern areas that will make for a fairly dull start to Thursday, with the best of any brighter weather across western areas. So we do have an easterly wind at the moment. That's because high pressure is sat over to the north and east of the UK, bringing in that easterly wind, and that's what's going to drag in the cloud overnight. Once again tonight, I think the cloud is going to be more extensive tonight compared to previous nights, and it'll probably linger a little longer into tomorrow morning. We could see some drizzly rain over any high ground as well, but with the strength of the breeze and fairly extensive cloud, it's going to be another mild night away from the clearer skies across the further north and west parts of Northern Ireland and western Scotland in particular, seeing a very fine start to the day. And with a fairly brisk breeze across more southern areas, the clouds should start to break up quite quickly across more southern areas of England, but across more northeastern areas, parts of central England, it will linger through a lot of the morning, even across parts of eastern Scotland, Aberdeenshire in particular, seeing some fairly extensive cloud, possibly some sea fog as well first thing. And across eastern coasts of Scotland, northeastern England, it will probably stay quite cloudy through a lot of the day. A cloudier and cooler day here to come compared to today, but elsewhere that cloud should clear away quite nicely after lunchtime to leave another dry and fine day for many areas. But notice there'll still be a fairly brisk easterly breeze as well, particularly across the parts of the Channel coast. But despite the breeze, it's still going to be feeling pretty warm for September, temperatures climbing as high as 26 degrees. Another fairly dull start to come on Friday, and that's when we see a real switch in our weather, as once that cloud does clear, we could see some fairly heavy and thundery showers developing across a lot of England and Wales. And it's going to stay quite unsettled for more southern areas all the way through the weekend until Sunday. In fact, we could see some surface water issues by Sunday. Bye-bye.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
You could beat good luck.
Mark Dolan tonight is your weekend dose of news, debate and entertainment.
This sounds like a wild conspiracy theory.
Don't miss My Big Opinion. Mark meets at My Take at 10.
Democracy is a funny old thing.
And we don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it.
Let's go and get another glass of that bubbly. You've earned it.
That's Mark Dolan tonight, Saturday and Sunday, 9 to 11, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry, Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
It's Patrick Christie's Tonight, and here we do things differently.
It's explaining the absolute madness of this, doesn't it?
It's explosive.
I mean, this is very good.
It's lively.
850. Your government sat there, Sean, and it did nothing.
It's controversial.
And the Middle East has been in turmoil since before I was born.
It's everything you need to kickstart your evening.
Everyone's had their Weetabix tonight. I love to see it.
That's Patrick Christie's Tonight, weeknights from 9 p.m. Only on GB News.